In the warm, hazy light of a Mississippi morning, the small town of Decatur stirred to life. Wood-framed houses sat quietly among towering oaks, their branches draped in Spanish moss that swayed gently in the humid air. On a modest farm just outside town, a young Medgar Evers rose before dawn, his bare feet touching the cool, worn floorboards of a home built by his father's hands. The smell of fresh soil and the distant lowing of cattle filled the air, a daily rhythm that shaped his earliest memories. Here, in the heart of the Deep South during the 1920s and 1930s, life was measured by the seasons and the unyielding labor of black families who worked the land they often did not own. Medgar, the third of 5 children, learned from his parents, James and Jessie Evers, that dignity was not given but cultivated through hard work, faith, and an unshakable sense of self-worth. His father worked at a sawmill and farmed a small plot, while his mother instilled in her children the values of education and moral integrity, often quoting scripture to remind them that they were as good as anyone else in the eyes of God. The Evers household was a sanctuary of pride and resilience, where despite the harsh realities of segregation, the children were taught to hold their heads high. As Medgar grew, the landscape of Decatur revealed its dual nature. The town square, with its red brick courthouse and shaded benches, was a place where white residents conducted business and socialized freely. For black families, however, movement was constrained by invisible but strictly enforced boundaries. Medgar walked to the segregated school, a long trek past cotton fields and white clapboard churches, his path a daily lesson in the geography of inequality. He noticed the stark differences, the well-paved streets of white neighborhoods compared to the dusty, rutted roads in his own community, the new textbooks discarded from the white school and handed down, pages torn and margins filled with someone else's notes. Yet, within his home, there was no sense of inferiority. His parents encouraged debate and curiosity, and Medgar developed a quiet, observant nature, absorbing the world around him with keen intelligence. He worked odd jobs, delivering newspapers and helping neighbors, learning the value of service and the strength found in community bonds. The church was a cornerstone, its wooden pews and heartfelt hymns providing spiritual sustenance and a space where collective aspirations for justice were nurtured. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 altered the course of Medgar's life, as it did for millions of Americans. He enlisted in the United States Army, leaving behind the familiar fields of Mississippi for the uncertainty of war. Serving in Europe, he was part of a segregated unit, a reality that stung deeply. He fought for freedoms abroad that he was denied at home, a contradiction that sharpened his awareness of American hypocrisy. In the French countryside, he saw villages where black soldiers were treated with respect and gratitude, a stark contrast to the indignities of the Jim Crow South. The architecture of ancient stone churches and the gentle light of the European countryside offered a glimpse of a different world, one where his humanity was not questioned. He rose to the rank of sergeant, his leadership skills honed in the crucible of combat, and he returned to Mississippi in 1945 with a renewed determination. The uniform he wore had not shielded him from racism upon his return. At a bus stop, he was forced to give up his seat to a white man, a bitter reminder that his service meant little in the eyes of segregationists. This moment crystallized his resolve. He would dedicate his life to ensuring that the ideals he fought for overseas would become a reality for his people at home. The post-war South was a place of both promise and peril. Medgar used the GI Bill to pursue higher education, a path that would have been nearly impossible before the war. He enrolled at Alcorn Agricultural and Mechanical College, a historically black institution nestled among the green rolling hills of Lorman, Mississippi. The campus, with its stately brick buildings and ancient oaks, became a haven for intellectual growth. There, he studied business administration, but his true education came from the exchange of ideas with fellow veterans and professors who challenged the status quo. He met Myrlie Evers, a fellow student whose grace and intelligence matched his own. Their courtship unfolded amidst the backdrop of campus life, a partnership that would become legendary. In the quiet of the library, With sunlight streaming through tall windows, Medgar read deeply about American democracy and the principles of equality, his belief in the nation's potential undimmed by its failures. He understood that change would require not just courage but strategic action, a lesson he carried into the burgeoning civil rights movement. The seeds planted in his childhood, the work ethic, the moral clarity, the quiet strength, now began to bloom into a life of purpose, setting the stage for the battles ahead. The campus of Alcorn State College stretched across the gentle hills of Lorman, Mississippi, a place where the hum of cicadas and the rustle of magnolia leaves provided a soothing backdrop to academic pursuit. In the late 1940s, Medgar Evers walked these grounds with a sense of purpose, his military bearing softened by the contemplative air of a student. The red brick buildings, with their white columns and wide verandas, stood as monuments to Black aspiration, offering a sanctuary for learning in a state that denied basic rights. Here, Medgar immersed himself in studies, but his education extended beyond the classroom. He joined the debate team, sharpening his ability to articulate the injustices of segregation, and he became involved in campus organizations that fostered leadership. It was at Alcorn that he met Myrlie, a partnership that would become the emotional and strategic core of his life's work. Together, they envisioned a future where their children would not face the same barriers. The library, with its high ceilings and quiet corners, became a second home, where Medgar pored over legal texts and history, understanding that the fight for civil rights required both moral courage and meticulous preparation. After graduation, Evers moved to the Mississippi Delta, a region of vast cotton fields and entrenched poverty, where he worked as an insurance salesman. This role was more than a job. It was a window into the lives of the most vulnerable. Driving along dusty backroads, he visited sharecropper shacks, their wooden walls weathered by sun and rain. He listened to stories of exploitation and fear, witnessing firsthand the economic stranglehold that suppressed Black agency. The landscape itself seemed to mirror the oppression, endless rows of cotton stretching under a blazing sun, with little shade or relief. Yet, in these humble homes, he found resilience and a hunger for change. His work with the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, RCNL, a grassroots organization founded by Dr. T.R.M. Howard, channeled this energy into action. The RCNL held large annual meetings in the all-Black town of Mound Bayou, where thousands gathered in open-air pavilions to hear speeches on voter registration and economic empowerment. The architecture of these gatherings, simple wooden platforms adorned with bunting, the crowd seated on folding chairs under a canopy of trees, reflected the grassroots nature of the movement. Evers became a key organizer, his quiet charisma drawing people to the cause. In 1954, the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision declared school segregation unconstitutional, igniting hope and fierce resistance across the South. Evers applied to the University of Mississippi Law School, knowing full well that his rejection would provide the NAACP with a legal challenge. His application was a deliberate act, a strategic move to force the state to confront its discriminatory practices. When the rejection letter arrived, it was no surprise, but it became a tool in the broader struggle. That same year, he became the NAACP's first field secretary in Mississippi, a position that placed him on the front lines of the movement. He set up a small office in Jackson, a modest room with a desk, a typewriter, and a telephone, where he coordinated efforts across the state. The work was methodical, investigating acts of violence, documenting lynchings, and providing legal support to victims. The walls of his office were soon covered with maps and lists, a cartography of injustice that he was determined to dismantle. The murder of Emmett Till in 1955 shook the nation, and for Evers, it was a pivotal moment. The 14-year-old from Chicago, visiting relatives in Money, Mississippi, was brutally killed for allegedly whistling at a white woman. Evers, tasked with investigating the case for the NAACP, traveled to the Delta, where the air was thick with fear and silence. He interviewed witnesses in secret, often meeting them in darkened churches or secluded fields, the only light coming from a flickering lantern or the moon overhead. He gathered evidence, risking his life to bring the truth to light. The trial, held in a courthouse with soaring columns and a packed gallery, ended in acquittal, a stark reminder of the legal system's complicity. The experience deepened Evers' resolve, but it also revealed the limitations of working within a system designed to protect white supremacy. He understood that while legal challenges were essential, they were not enough. The movement needed to build power from the ground up, through education and economic pressure. In the quiet moments after the trial, driving back to Jackson on empty highways, the headlights cutting through the darkness, he reflected on the cost of progress and the long road ahead. In the warm, heavy air of a Mississippi morning, the sun rises over fields of cotton and modest wooden homes. A rooster crows in the distance, and the smell of fresh coffee drifts from a kitchen window. This is the world Medgar Evers moved through each day, a landscape of quiet determination, where ordinary people prepared for extraordinary acts of courage. In the early 1960s, as NAACP Field Secretary, Evers traveled the back roads of the state, his car kicking up dust as he went from one small town to the next, carrying with him the simple but revolutionary idea that every citizen should have the right to vote. His work centered on voter registration drives, a task both methodical and dangerous. In church basements and community halls, under the hum of ceiling fans, Evers would sit with groups of Black Mississippians, explaining the registration process with patience and clarity. He knew that literacy tests and poll taxes were designed to intimidate and exclude, so he taught people how to interpret complex sections of the state constitution, how to fill out forms without error. His voice was calm, steady, a teacher's voice, but his message was urgent. He believed that the ballot was the key to changing the system from within, and he dedicated long hours to this painstaking, face-to-face work. But voter registration was only one front in a broader struggle. Evers also organized economic boycotts of white-owned businesses that refused to hire or serve Black customers fairly. He understood that in a segregated economy, the power of the dollar could speak loudly. He encouraged communities to shop instead at Black-owned stores or to simply withhold their money from places that treated them as second-class citizens. This strategy required immense coordination and sacrifice, as many families depended on those very stores for goods, and the risk of retaliation was severe. Evers walked a careful line, urging collective action while knowing that each person who participated put their job, their home, and their safety on the line. The dangers were not abstract. Evers faced constant threats, anonymous phone calls in the night, envelopes containing hateful messages, and the ever-present possibility of violence. He was arrested multiple times on trumped-up charges, dragged from his car, and held in jail cells simply for doing his work. His home in Jackson became both a refuge and a target. His wife Myrlie and their young children learned to live with fear, dropping to the floor when they heard a car backfire, because it might be a gunshot. Yet Evers persisted, rising before dawn each day, straightening his tie, and stepping out into a world that often met him with hostility. He drew strength from the people he served, the farmers, teachers, and domestic workers who risked everything to attend a meeting or attempt to register. One of the most powerful aspects of Evers' approach was his ability to connect individual acts of courage to a larger movement. He documented cases of violence and discrimination, photographing the scars of beaten activists and the charred remains of burned churches. These images, sent to national newspapers and the Justice Department, brought the reality of Mississippi's racial terror to a wider audience. He was not just an organizer, he was a witness, ensuring that the stories of the oppressed would not be forgotten. This work was often done late at night, in the small office he kept, the light from his desk lamp casting long shadows as he typed reports that might one day help bring change. The voter registration drives and boycotts slowly built momentum, but they also provoked fierce backlash. The White Citizens Council and the Ku Klux Klan stepped up their campaigns of intimidation. Crosses were burned on the lawns of those who dared to register. Names were published in local papers as a form of public shaming. Evers himself became a primary target, his photograph appearing on Klan flyers. Still, He refused to be silenced. He spoke at mass meetings, his voice rising not in anger, but in a kind of solemn hope, reminding his listeners that their cause was just and that history would vindicate them. He often quoted the Constitution, not as a weapon, but as a promise still unkept. Through this period, Evers helped build a foundation for what would become the Freedom Summer of 1964, though he would not live to see it. His work demonstrated that lasting change requires not just dramatic protests, but the daily, unglamorous labor of organizing, filling out forms, knocking on doors, teaching literacy, and sustaining hope in the face of terror. As the sun sets on another Mississippi evening, the cicadas begin their chorus and the air cools slightly. In a small house, a family gathers around a radio, listening for news. They have registered to vote, and though they know the risks, they feel a quiet pride. This is the legacy of Medgar Evers, not just the headlines, but the countless small acts of bravery he inspired, each one a step toward a more just society. The autumn of 1962 arrived in Mississippi with a crispness in the air and the scent of turning leaves. On the campus of the University of Mississippi, known as Ole Miss, the stately columns of the Lyceum building stood white against a brilliant blue sky, embodying a tradition that had, for over a century, excluded Black students. It was here that Medgar Evers focused his relentless efforts, working to enroll James Meredith, a determined Air Force veteran who had applied to the university multiple times, only to be rejected on racial grounds. Evers, as NAACP Field Secretary, became Meredith's guide and advocate, navigating a labyrinth of legal challenges and administrative stonewalling with quiet, strategic persistence. Evers' work was often behind the scenes, in the unglamorous spaces of law libraries and courthouse hallways. He spent countless hours preparing documents, meeting with attorneys, and coaching Meredith on what to expect. The process was exhausting. Each legal victory was met with a new delaying tactic. Each step forward seemed to invite a wave of hostility. Yet Evers remained steady, drawing on his deep belief in the Constitution and his own military service. He saw Meredith's admission not as a symbolic gesture, but as a concrete test of whether the nation would live up to its founding ideals. In the evenings, he would return home to his family, the weight of the day visible in his eyes, but his resolve undimmed. Finally, after a federal court order, Meredith was scheduled to register on campus. The night before his arrival, September 30th, 1962, a mob of thousands gathered on the Ole Miss grounds, their anger fueled by segregationist politicians and outside agitators. Evers was not on campus that night. He monitored events from a distance, his heart heavy with worry. As darkness fell, the situation spiraled into violence. Rocks and bottles flew, cars were overturned, and federal marshals were attacked. The air filled with tear gas and the sound of gunfire. By morning, 2 people were dead, and the campus looked like a war zone. But James Meredith, protected by federal troops, enrolled in his first class. It was a victory, but one stained with blood. In the aftermath, Evers continued his work, but the national spotlight brought new dangers. The integration of Ole Miss made headlines around the world, and Evers became a more visible symbol of the movement in Mississippi. He gave interviews, spoke at rallies, and used the attention to push for further desegregation. But this visibility also intensified the retaliation from the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist groups. His home was firebombed, and threats against his life became more frequent and explicit. Myrlie later recalled how they would sit in the dark, listening to the sounds outside, unsure if each passing car might bring an attack. Still, Evers refused to back down, believing that to retreat would be to betray all those who had sacrificed. The Ole Miss crisis also revealed the deep divisions within Mississippi and the nation. Evers understood that legal victories were essential but insufficient. They had to be accompanied by a change in hearts and minds. He worked to build bridges, speaking to moderate white leaders and urging them to accept the inevitable tide of integration. These conversations were often tense, held in the neutral spaces of church basements or civic halls, with the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Evers' approach was not confrontational but persuasive, appealing to shared Christian values and the practical need to avoid further violence. Yet he also recognized the limits of persuasion in a society structured by racial hierarchy. Through it all, Evers maintained a relentless schedule. He would rise before dawn, drive hundreds of miles across the state, and return late at night to his family, stealing moments of normalcy, helping his children with homework, sharing a quiet meal with Myrlie. These small rituals were his anchor, a reminder of what he was fighting for. The integration of Ole Miss had shown that change was possible, but it also underscored the high cost of that change. Evers knew that his own life was in danger, but he often said that he was willing to pay that price if it meant a better future for his children and for all Black Americans. As the days grew shorter and the Mississippi winter approached, the national spotlight began to shift, but Evers' work did not. He continued organizing boycotts, investigating violence, and pushing for voter registration. The Ole Miss victory had energized the movement, but it had also placed a target squarely on his back. In the quiet moments, he would sometimes look out the window of his Jackson home, watching the neighborhood children play, and think about the world he wanted to build, a world where his own children could walk through any door, attend any school, and live without fear. That vision, so simple yet so radical, drove him forward, even as the shadows gathered around him. The evening of June 11, 1963, settled over Jackson, Mississippi, with the heavy, humid air of a deep South summer. At the modest ranch-style home on Gwine Street, the scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the twilight, and the porch light cast a soft, yellow glow onto the concrete driveway. Inside, Medgar Evers had just returned from a long day of NAACP work, his suit jacket draped over a chair, his tie loosened. His wife, Myrlie, and their 3 young children had watched President Kennedy's historic civil rights address on television, a speech that seemed to echo the very principles Medgar had fought for. The children, Daryl, Rena, and Van, were finally asleep, their rooms quiet, the murmur of a distant radio drifting through an open window. It was a moment of fragile domestic peace, a snapshot of ordinary family life, unaware that the darkness outside held a terrible intent. As Medgar stepped out of his car, a 1962 Oldsmobile, the night was pierced by a single, thunderous crack. The sound rolled across the quiet neighborhood, startling birds from the trees and jolting Myrlie from her seat. She rushed to the door, her heart pounding, and found her husband lying in a pool of blood on the carport's cool cement, his keys still clutched in his hand. The bullet, fired from a high-powered rifle, had torn through his back and exited his chest. Neighbors emerged from their homes, their faces pale under the streetlights, as Myrlie's screams shattered the stillness. A frantic call for an ambulance brought the wail of sirens, but the drive to the hospital was a blur of desperation. Medgar Evers was pronounced dead at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, just hours after hearing a president speak of equality. He was 37 years old, a husband, a father, a veteran, and a tireless crusader for justice, silenced by an assassin's bullet. The news of Medgar's murder spread like wildfire, igniting a storm of grief and fury across the nation. In Jackson, the Black community mourned openly, their sorrow spilling into the streets. A planned march turned into a confrontation with police, who used dogs and batons to disperse the crowd, the very brutality Evers had fought against now on full display. The national press descended, and the image of Myrlie Evers, dignified yet devastated, holding her children at the funeral, became a searing symbol of the movement's cost. The funeral service, held at the Masonic Temple on Lynch Street, was packed with mourners, their voices rising in hymns of hope and pain. Outside, the heat shimmered off the pavement as a long procession walked to the Collins funeral home, the air thick with the scent of flowers and the weight of injustice. Civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., offered words of comfort and resolve, but the question lingered: would Medgar's death be the spark that finally awakened a nation? The answer began to take shape as Medgar Evers was laid to rest with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The journey from Jackson to the rolling green hills of Virginia was a poignant tribute to a man who had served his country in war only to be denied its freedoms at home. On June 19th, under a canopy of ancient oaks, a horse-drawn caisson carried his flag-draped coffin to Section 36, a site reserved for heroes. The rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on the pavement, the solemn notes of a bugle playing taps, and the sharp report of a rifle salute echoed across the serene landscape. Myrlie, dressed in black, accepted the folded flag with quiet strength, her children by her side. The ceremony, broadcast on national television, brought the reality of racial violence into living rooms across America, transforming Medgar from a local activist into a national martyr. His grave, overlooking the Potomac River, became a pilgrimage site, a place where the breeze carried whispers of a dream deferred. In the weeks and months that followed, Medgar's assassination became a catalyst for change, pushing the faltering civil rights bill toward passage. President Kennedy, who had spoken so eloquently on the night of Medgar's death, was himself assassinated just 5 months later, but his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, seized the momentum. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed into law on July 2nd, was a direct legacy of Medgar's sacrifice. Its provisions banning discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and federally funded programs were the very protections Medgar had marched for, boycotted for, and ultimately died for. In the halls of Congress, lawmakers invoked his name, and in the streets, activists carried his photograph. The bill's passage was a monumental victory, yet it was tinged with the bitter knowledge that it had taken a bullet to break the legislative stalemate. Medgar's blood had watered the roots of a more just America. Yet, the awakening was incomplete. While the Civil Rights Act dismantled Jim Crow's legal framework, the entrenched racism that had killed Medgar Evers persisted. The slow, often violent resistance to integration in Mississippi and beyond revealed the limits of legislation alone. The man suspected of the murder, white supremacist Byron de la Beckwith, was tried twice in 1964, but all-white juries deadlocked, and he walked free. For Myrlie Evers, the fight was far from over. She moved her family to California, where she rebuilt her life, earned a degree, and eventually became a national NAACP leader, all while keeping the flame of her husband's memory alive. The house on Gwynne Street stood empty for years, a silent monument to a life cut short, its driveway shadowed by the memory of that June night. The quest for justice would become a decades-long odyssey, a testament to the enduring power of one man's courage to inspire a nation, even in death. In the quiet of a Los Angeles morning, years after the tragedy, Myrlie Evers sat at a wooden desk, surrounded by stacks of letters, legal documents, and yellowed newspaper clippings. The California sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Her fingers traced the edges of a photograph of Medgar, his smile frozen in time, as she prepared for another day of what had become her life's mission, bringing her husband's killer to justice. The first 2 trials of Byron de la Beckwith, held in 1964 in the sweltering heat of a Mississippi courtroom, had ended in hung juries, the all-white panels unwilling to convict a fellow white man for the murder of a black civil rights leader. The verdicts were a bitter pill, but Myrlie refused to let the case gather dust in the archives of history. She carefully filed every piece of evidence, every transcript, knowing that one day, the climate might change. The hum of a distant lawnmower and the scent of jasmine from the garden were a stark contrast to the weight of her task, a testament to the resilience that kept her going. For 3 decades, Myrlie Evers balanced the demands of raising 3 children, pursuing a career, and rising to become the first female chair of the NAACP, all while nurturing the fragile hope of a new trial. The case file grew thick with new information, witnesses who had been intimidated, evidence that had been overlooked, and the growing public awareness of the injustice. The passage of time had transformed Mississippi, slowly, painfully, as the civil rights movement's gains took root. By the 1990s, A new generation of prosecutors and journalists began to re-examine the old wounds. The discovery that Beckwith had boasted of his crime at Klan rallies and that the state had suppressed key evidence breathed new life into the case. The quiet, persistent work of Myrlie and her supporters was like water wearing down stone. In her home study, the walls lined with awards and photographs of Medgar, she spoke to reporters and lawyers, her voice steady but edged with the fatigue of a long journey. The fight was no longer just for her family, it had become a symbol of America's unfinished reckoning with its past. In 1994, the gears of justice began to turn once more. The Hinds County Courthouse in Jackson, a stately building with white columns and a clock tower, once again became the stage for a trial that would capture the nation's attention. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of old wood and paper. Myrlie sat in the front row, her posture straight, her eyes fixed on the defendant. Byron de la Beckwith, now in his 70s, was a shadow of the man who had pulled the trigger, but his defiant smirk remained. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including new testimony and the rifle that had been recovered years earlier. The most damning moment came when witnesses recounted Beckwith's own words, his proud admissions of the murder. The jury, this time a diverse group of Mississippians, listened intently, their faces reflecting the weight of history. The trial was not just about one man's guilt, it was a referendum on the state's willingness to confront its legacy of racial violence. The slow, deliberate process was a testament to the power of persistence and the belief that the arc of the moral universe, however long, bends toward justice. On February 5, 1994, the verdict was read, guilty. The words echoed through the silent courtroom, and Myrlie Evers let out a breath she had held for 30 years. Outside, a crowd that had gathered on the courthouse steps erupted in cheers and tears, their voices rising into the winter sky. The scene was a stark contrast to the somber, fearful vigils of the 1960s. This was a moment of collective catharsis, a public acknowledgement that Medgar Evers' life had mattered and that justice, though delayed, was still possible. The old oak trees on the courthouse lawn stood as silent witnesses, their bare branches etched against the gray sky. Myrlie emerged, surrounded by her children and supporters, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. She spoke of Medgar's dream, of the long road traveled, and of the work still to be done. The conviction of Beckwith was more than a legal victory. It was a healing balm for a community and a nation, proving that the passage of time need not erase the demand for accountability. The legacy of Medgar Evers extends far beyond the courtroom. His name is etched into the fabric of American democracy, a reminder that ordinary people can effect extraordinary change. The Medgar and Myrlie Evers Institute, established to promote civil rights and social justice, carries forward his mission through education and advocacy. In Jackson, the home on Gwine Street is now a National Historic Landmark, its driveway a place of pilgrimage where visitors leave stones of remembrance. The house, with its modest brick facade and carport, stands as a testament to the domestic life that was shattered, but also to the courage that was born there. Across the country, schools, libraries, and streets bear his name, ensuring that new generations learn of his sacrifice. The quiet, persistent work of voter registration, which Medgar pioneered in the dangerous backroads of Mississippi, has blossomed into a fundamental right protected by law, though the struggle against suppression continues. His belief in the power of education to dismantle prejudice lives on in integrated classrooms and diverse campuses, a dream he fought for with every fiber of his being. Yet, the journey is unfinished. The same forces that Medgar confronted, racial discrimination, economic inequality, and systemic injustice, persist in new forms. The lessons of his life, however, offer a roadmap. His patience in the face of hatred, his strategic brilliance in organizing boycotts and registration drives, and his unwavering faith in American ideals provide a model for contemporary activism. The light that shone from that porch on Gwine Street still flickers in the hearts of those who march for justice today. Myrlie Evers, in her later years, continued to speak out, her voice a bridge from the past to the present. She often recalled the simple, daily rituals of their family life, the dinners together, the bedtime stories, the quiet moments before the violence, to remind us that Medgar was not just a martyr, but a man who loved and was loved. His legacy is not a relic to be admired from a distance. It is a call to action, a challenge to each of us to bend that arc a little further. In the long, slow twilight of history, Medgar Evers stands as a sentinel, his sacrifice a beacon guiding the way toward a more perfect union.